I always get questions asking about what my favorite weapons are or favorite builds are to use in Elden Ring. So for today, I'm just gonna make a video dedicated to the weapons that I find to be really fun or just look really cool and not really put them in like a meta type of build, but probably pair them alongside more of a thematic build. Now my favorite weapons to use typically are still gonna be really good. If a weapon is like really bad or below average, I typically don't really care to use it. Nor do I really care to build around it because it just hurts me. For instance, a weapon like the war pick I think is one of the coolest looking weapons in the entire game. I love the aesthetic of it, but it's such a mediocre weapon and it hurts me to even think about building around it because it could be so much better. All they had to do was give it the same moveset as like the hand axe, like a really fast light attack combo to compensate for its poor range and poor damage, and it would have been so cool. But yes, once again, we're just going to talk about some fun builds today for PvE only. The MARIKA'S hammer is my favorite weapon in the entire game, and it's purely because the way that it looks. I just like hammers and holy damage a lot aesthetically, and this weapon just tickles something in my brain. It just looks so cool, and thankfully, it actually is really good as well. It does decent damage, has a good strength faith-based scaling, mainly does physical damage, and its weapon skill in Goldbreaker is insane. For 26 FP, you become airborne, gets infinite hype armor, come crashing to the ground in a massive AoE, sends smaller enemies flying in the air. At point blank range, it does like over 40 stance damage. It's just a really fun and easy skill to use. Now when it comes to hammers themselves, they don't really do too much that's good compared to a lot of other weapon types. But if I were to build around them, it's always going to end up being a charged heavy attack build or a guard countering build because they actually get really quick attacks in both of those things and get some pretty good stance damage too. And I can probably speak for a lot of people when I say this, and that deflecting builds probably make for the most fun builds in the entire game, because it is extremely satisfying when you get rewarded for like timing a block correctly. And then guard counters, it is really fun to pull off as well. And the fact that we have a crystal tier that can enhance the damage of these guard counters by up to 80% more damage and 50% more stance damage is just ridiculous. And it lasts 5 minutes too. Now we are going to pair the MARIKA'S hammer alongside a faith build because yes, even though it actually does get better damage with strength, there are a couple of benefits that we do gain. And that's one, we actually can maximize the damage of our critical attacks with a sacred infused misericord. And we can benefit off lots of different types of damaging spells and buffs too. Because yeah, any single time that we do get a stance break, I'm just going to switch to the misericord to get the critical attack because this weapon is like the best critical damaging weapon in the game. It's extremely light. And with our faith build and a sacred infusion, it's going to do lots and lots of damage. I do also have it infused with Sacred Order. The reason being is because it actually can boost your damage of both hands by 10%, and this actually can include your seal and some spell types of damage. So if you wanted to use spells mainly, you can have this as an option to just help boost them. Now you may also notice that I do have the brass shield equipped, and the main reason being is because it looks cool. It fits the aesthetic of the outfit and it just matches perfectly, so I just have it equipped for that reason. But you actually still can benefit off using it because it's probably the best shield in the game with its really high guard boost. So if you didn't have access to the deflecting tier yet, or if the deflecting tier wore off, you could just actually use this to just help do those guard counters. Or if you are just getting used to the whole deflecting build concept, using the shield can be a lot more forgiving. But as for the talismans, we're obviously going to have the two-handed talisman because this is basically just free damage as long as the weapon is two-handed. But no, this does not include critical attack damage or skill damage. We're going to have the Blade of Mercy, which is 20% more damage every single time that we get a critical attack, which is going to be happening a lot. Shard of Alexander for more skill damage, and the Sacred Scorpion Charm, which this one you can replace it for like the Curved Sword Talisman or something to just help boost your neutral game, because the talisman does make you take a bit more damage. But just being able to just get more damage through your holy sources is obviously going to be really good because it's not only going to extend to both of your weapons, but to some of our spells that we're going to be using, which all of our spells are just holy damaging based to just help fit the theme. Don't really care to use any other damage types. Our main option is going to be Golden Arcs. I think this spell just looks really fucking cool. It's an okay holy damaging spell, goes relatively far, doesn't really travel that quickly. The damage isn't really that great either, unless you do pair it alongside a lot of other different types of buffs. But one benefit that it actually does have is its stance damage. It gets 15 stance damage for the whole 3 rings, and you can consecutively spam it over and over again to actually output some decent stance damage. I do also have Black Blade, which is another holy damaging projectile, does some destined death damage over time, which is really good for bosses that have larger amounts of health, and for just large bosses in general, because it actually can hit multiple times and just do amazing damage. You can go with Multi-Laid Ring of Light or Discus of Light as your main single target range projectile attack. If you just want to hit enemies at these further distances, I would just use one of these ones. And then obviously when you have like higher amounts of faith, you're going to have Golden Vow, Blessing of the Earth Tree, have a healing spell as well. I went with Heal from Afar because it actually is pretty fun to use with a quick animation. And I do also have Howl of Shiburi, which yes, this body buff does make you take a lot more damage. So if you're not really confident in using it, I would just switch this one off for like a damage negation spell or potentially Flame Gummy Strength too. There are many instances in this game to where we have really cool spells and weapons, but they might just end up being outclassed by something else. And I kind of want to make a build around some of those things, namely the Blood Flame spells and the Regalia of Ochad, which for me are probably some of my favorite things to use in this game. Yes, the Regalia might be outclassed by the Mariahs in almost every instance, but I actually do like the Regalia better, purely because I think it looks cooler. And I do like straight swords more aesthetically speaking too, but there are a couple of benefits that the Regalia does have. The major one is that it is a straight sword, so it does actually have the better power stancing combo, and with the Regalia and how good the weapon skill is, when paired alongside the multi-hit talismans, it might make for better synergy in that area, and also the Regalia gets a better arcane scaling. And with both of these weapons, going into the arcane stat not only boosts the physical damage, but it also boosts the magic damage too, so you gain lots of returns by going into this particular stat. So whereas the Mariah's you probably benefit of going into more strength, the Regalia, you can just go all into arcane, and with an arcane build, we can actually use some spells too. Now, even though I did say that the Regalia is probably better power stanced, just for the sake of really having the spells complement the weapon nicely, I'm just going to leave a seal in my offhand the entire time and not really have to worry about switching back and forth, because that can just be really annoying and then sour the gameplay experience just doing this constant toggling. But the talismans for this build, we're obviously going to have the Godfrey's Icon, Shard of Alexander, Millicent's Prosthesis, and we are going to have the Thorny Cracked tier alongside with this. Because yeah, all these different types of buffs helps boost the damage of this skill immensely, and it can just have one-shotting type of potential. But as for the last slots, I actually am going to go with the Lord of Blood Exaltation, and I do have the Flames tier equipped as well. Because as I mentioned, I'm going to be using some Blood Flame spells, and I'm going to use some Dragon spells as well, because we're going to go into an Arcane build and use the Dragon Communion Seal, which helps boost the damage of our Dragon-based spells, so we might as well. But for the Blood Flame spells, we obviously are going to go with Blood Flame Talons and Furious Blade of Arnspark. Now you might think that both of these kind of do the exact same thing, but there are benefits to both. Furious Blade of Arnspark can lunge in really far and stun lock these smaller types of trash mobs really well. I kind of like this one to like lead off a fight. In the middle of an engagement, it can be really hard unless you are fighting enemies that can be staggered. And Blood Flame Talons is really good if you just have a smaller opening. It can also stagger pretty well, but it does require you being a lot closer. So the way I like to use this is just lead off with the Furious Blade of Arnspark and then switch back to the Blood Flame Talons to potentially proc the bleed. And once proccing the bleed, you can just proc the buffs of the Lord of Blood Exaltation, and you can go the White Mask if you wanted to. I didn't bother because it looks like shit. And as for the Dragon-based spells, I'm obviously going to have Dragon Fire because we do have the Flame tier, and I have Flame Grant Me Strength too. So it's going to be a nice range-based option. And I do have a Dragon Claw as well, which yes, is going to be outclassed by Dragon more, but I think Dragon Claw looks cooler. It does have lower requirements, and you can combo it back and forth if you have a seal in your left and your right hand, which I actually do show here in the gameplay. It's not necessary to do this, but it is pretty cool, and it is a nice stance breaking option. So there are plenty of different things that you can play around with this build, and every single part of it is really fun in my opinion. The Death Knight's Long Halved Axe is probably my favorite weapon to come out of the DLC. It is another decent strength faith-based weapon with some split lightning damage. Does get a good Great Axe moveset with that nice horizontal swipe for a heavy. But the best part about it is going to be its unique skill in Blink Bolt Long Halved Axe, which does result in a Blink Bolt dodge, and the follow-up attack is a nice lightning AoE slam attack. And all these dodging types of skills are just so fun to use, and I think Blink Bolt is the best amongst them because not only does it look really cool, but actually dashes into the enemy really far, and having to preemptively use it due to its long starting up animation makes it feel more satisfying to pull off with its higher skill ceiling. And having this badass animation of you just jumping up into the air and slamming down a cool-ass lightning axe that does some decent damage, some decent stance damage, it doesn't really get much more badass. Now when going into a strength faith build, the Clawmark Seal is probably going to be a must in almost every instance. And there are going to be a handful of spells that we can use. I decided to go with this cool Crucible Dragon Cult build, where I'll obviously use some of the Crucible spells and some Dragon Cult spells, and I decided to use the ones that I just think are the coolest. Things like Crucible Horns and Crucible Tail are not really the highest damaging things, but they can actually output some high amounts of stance damage. A fully charged Horns does over 30 stance damage, and a fully charged Tail can do over 40, and that in combination with a really cool skill, you can be stance breaking enemies really quickly. They're probably not going to be the most useful in the DLC because you don't really get that long of an opening to use it. But when you are fighting some quick enemies that can be staggered, these are really good because they can send them flying, and you also get some nice hyper armor. Now as for your lightning spells, I have Frozen Lightning Spear, which if you are going to fight some enemies that are weaker to frost, or just to have an AoE option in general, this one is actually pretty solid. Not going to be like the best lightning spell overall. It kind of has some weird hit detection, doesn't track really well, but it can hit larger bosses multiple times, and if enemies only really have like 200 to 300 frost resist, then this is going to be an extremely beneficial spell to have. You just lead off the fight with this, debuff the enemy, and then switch back to your other options. Which, speaking of which, I do have Ancient Dragon's Lightning Spear too, which is another close range AoE spell that gets some nice hyper armor, very similar to Crucible Tail, but this one is going to have a faster animation and do more damage. So if you're fighting an enemy where you don't really care to get a stance break, I will just use this. And you could also just throw in Lightning Spear as well if you just wanted a basic projectile attack. And then obviously Golden Vow, Flame Grant Me Strength, Blessings Boon. Any single time that you have a decent amount of faith, you just have to use some of these spells. But as for the talismans, obviously the two-handed talisman, this is just free damage. Shard of Alexander for more skill damage. I do have the Blade of Mercy for just more damage when I get a critical attack. And the Flox Canvas talisman, which is just more damage to our spells. And in the crystal tier, I have the lightning tier for more damage and the opaline heart tier for more damage negation. The Sword of Night is one of the edgiest weapons to come out of the game. It's a katana, which already makes it edgy, but it actually has a cool darkness glowing effect. And its skill does do this nice flurry animation. And honestly, this is my personal favorite katana in the game, not just based on aesthetic alone, but also its playstyle is actually extremely fun and has a high skill ceiling, and that's purely because of its weapon skill in Witching Hour Slash. Yes, it can be easily spammed over and over. You can stun lock enemies, can do some decent damage, can help proc bleed pretty quickly too. Now, when you do have it fully charged, it is somewhat of a longer animation, so it might not be the most useful thing in every single circumstance of the game, but it actually does lunge in really far. So one thing you actually can do is try and bait out enemy attacks, and when they're about to finish their combo, you charge up the skill, and when they finish, you just lunge in towards them. And just going based on this playstyle alone just feels so satisfying, and it's actually very visually pleasing too. Now, unfortunately, having it fully charged only improves the damage in its hitboxes. It actually doesn't improve the bleed build-up, which is kind of unfortunate. So it's probably not going to be the best weapon for a blood loss type of build, but we are just going to go all into damage. Shard of Alexander, Godfrey's Icon, multi-hit talismans, 20 tier, all of these things is going to help dramatically improve our damage. But with this build, it is just pure dexterity, so therefore you don't really have much versatility when it comes to like spells. But one thing that you may have noticed me using is that the Smith Script Dagger. I actually have this weapon equipped in the offhand, and any single time that enemies just get a bit further away from me, I just spam the daggers, which actually does do a little bit of chip damage, but more importantly, it stops enemies from regenerating their poise, and it also keeps the uptime of the multi-hit talismans, because for like every single tier of damage, it has like a 3-second cooldown, and this thing actually gets an S scaling and dexterity when keen infused, so it's not like the damage is really going to be that bad either. I might as well use its Ash of War slot for something pretty useful. In this instance, I'm going with Divine Beast Frost Stomp. Every single cold-based Ash of War actually does scale with dexterity and intelligence, and this skill is going to help complement the build perfectly because you have a nice ranged-based AoE attack, and more importantly, it's going to help us proc Frost, which you can just lead off a boss fight with something like this, and when enemies get procced with Frost, they're going to take a flat 10% damage and get debuffed to take 20% more damage for the next 30 seconds. So I think this is going to be a very nice pairing alongside with this build. And it is very simple and straightforward too. If you only have small amounts of openings, then using the uncharged heavy attack is perfectly fine because it does result in a nice little double swipe. And when enemies get further away from you, you can just use the Smith Script Dagger light attacks or two-handed to use a skill. Now for the last build, I desperately wanted to make a Mesmer Fire type of build, but for the sake of variety and actually adding an intelligence option, I decided to go with this Gravity Gladiator, which involves us using the Battle Hammer and some gravity-based spells, and with a Strength Intelligence-based build. Now yes, this Great Hammer is nowhere near as good as a lot of the other Great Hammers. Thankfully, it still is a Great Hammer with a regular Great Hammer moveset, therefore it still gets pretty quick movesets and amazing stance damage, but in terms of its range and its regular damage, it's just not going to be as good as a lot of the other ones. However, with a Cold Infusion, it actually does retain some of the best scalings. It does get a B scaling in strength and a C scaling in intelligence, and it can make it one of the highest damaging in class with this particular infusion. But the main reason why I'm going with the Battle Hammer is because it looks really cool. I wish it did have like a unique moveset or like some cool power sensing combo like what the duelists actually have, but I'm still going to use it because it looks badass. And we are going to have this infused with Waves of Darkness, which is another gravity based attack. And the cool thing is about Waves of Darkness with a cold infusion is that these magic AoE attacks also do help proc Frost as well. So you can very well lead off a boss fight with this particular attack. It's going to do very good damage, some decent stance damage, and probably proc Frost in an instant. And at that point, you can either just go ahead into a charged heavy attack build if you're just in the regular base game, or go with a deflecting build once you have gained access to the DLC, which is what we're going to be going with. The deflecting tier is basically just broken. It makes so many boss fights just completely easy. You take basically no damage in blocking, and it can enhance your guard countering attacks by up to 80% more damage and 50% more stance damage. And we're using things like the two-handed talisman and Blade of Mercy. Almost any single deflecting build can become broken. If you haven't gained access to the DLC, then using the Axe Talisman and maybe the Dagger Talisman could be a nice replacement. We're also going to have the Shard of Alexander to help boost our skill damage, and the Godfrey's Icon to help boost the damage of some of our spells, which as I mentioned, we're only going to be having gravity spells. But the cool thing is about the gravity spells is that they cover such a wide variation. You have a good physical range-based poise breaking option. You have a quick magic-based tracking option. You have a close-range magic AoE. You have a ranged-based physical damaging AoE. And then you have a spell in Meteorite or Meteorite of Estelle that can melt basically every boss in the entire game as long as you do have a long enough opening. So it covers basically everything that you need. Now, if you didn't really care to use many spells, then I would go into more strength than intelligence. But at this level, we are going to use the Academy Glintstone staff, and we are going to have the Meteorite staff in the offhands, because this can help boost our damage of the gravity sorceries by 30% as long as we just have it equipped. So the entire build has lots of freedoms. You can either just spam the skill, you can go ahead and use lots of guard countering if you want to, or you could very well just use a bunch of spells too. Okay, that's now done and completed. You guys now know what my personal favorite things are in this game. Now, if you did like the concept of this video and want to see some more thematic types of builds, just let me know down in the comments. And yeah, I'll catch you guys in the next. Bye.